Oh, welcome to you both and whoever else will be joining us momentarily. So I'm going to begin with a case narrative, and then we'll launch it from there. Both parents appeared for the first interview. They identified Kirk's problem as being a thumbsucker with shreds of an old blanket, which he soaks in urine. Even after mother washed it, Kirk is anuretic every night. This is an apparently withdrawn child ever since the death of his brother from myocarditis, when Kirk was almost 3 years of age. Kelly had been sick for almost 10 months and died in Boston, where he had been taken for consultation after an initial workup at Babies and Children's Hospital. Kirk had been left during this time. The mother left entirely during this period in a psychological sense. She had Kirk cared for during Kelly's illness by her own mother, who, according to Kirk's father, was quite hysterical. The mother, according to her and her husband, was in a depression for about 4 years after the death of Kelly. Kelly had been a brilliant child. He talked well and was considered to be a star. He was the light of his mother's eye. Mother was and is a TV commercial spokesperson. Kirk had a good relationship with his brother prior to his death and with his mother, but it was entirely secondary to Kelly. The father generally assumed the mother's role with Kirk. The father would take Kirk, who was quite regressed at this time, to movies, Snow White, for example, plus other scary movies. The mother, following Kelly's illness because of her rejection of Kirk, was then rejected by Kirk. According to my notes, the boy was very angry with his mother. This began to change somewhat when she had been in psychotherapy. This is because she was able to work more effectively with him, could talk with him, and be more of a mother. She could communicate with him, which she could not do previously because of Kelly. It is not clear why the parents have brought Kirk at this point, when he has obviously been quite disturbed for years. There is obviously much disagreement between the parents. The mother took off for a week by herself after Kelly's death, which likely made things more difficult, and several times a similar trip has been taken ever since. I thought, as I understood my notes, that the mother's depression, without doubt, has played a major part in the way she expresses her anger at her husband and at Kirk's refusal to let her cuddle or kiss him. Kirk regressed quite a bit after Kelly's death and cried for days. As I recall, my recommendation was that Kirk needed psychotherapy or perhaps an analysis to try to work through the traumatic events in his life, in addition to the ordinary, overstimulated, and exciting things going on around him. As I recall, I'm not entirely sure, I think I came down on the side of analysis rather than psychotherapy, because I thought Kirk likely had rather major unconscious internalized conflicts. These are the notes as I've reconstructed them. I'm sure there are inaccuracies, but it's likely there's enough to piece together any information you, Kirk, would like to include in whatever it is you're writing. So I begin with that narrative, which is in my book, and that's just an excerpt from it, because I'm really trying to show how the roots of life-destroying, as distinct from life-enhancing anxiety, can emerge. This is a juncture. This is a fork in the road, if you will, in my own life. where I could have readily, without intervention, most likely, ended up with a great deal of life-destroying anxiety. And I think you can glean that from the upheaval that I experienced as a 2-3-year-old child. This report was actually from when I was 6 years old. My mother took me to a child analyst. He was referred from her analyst, and so I was in very bad shape for several years leading up to that point. But you can imagine that at 2, the upheaval of losing a brother, of my parents losing a child, was an extremely shattering, chaotic situation. It just put a rip in our routine and familiar worlds. It was completely changed at that point. So I had a lot of fears of death and dying, of germs, of illness. I'm sure I was hypochondriacal. I had a lot of night terrors. I was terribly afraid of both living and dying. And I think I would have been on that trajectory had I not had comparatively very supportive parents, even though my mother, as you heard, was absent for periods of time, physically and emotionally, which I now understand very, very vividly, how that would have happened. And there was a great deal of conflict between me and her, and between her and my father, whom she eventually divorced. So a very tumultuous time that could have ended up radically different than it did. I look at the psychoanalysis that I had as a child at 6 years old. And by the way, I got these notes from my analyst about 30 years ago when I was writing something else. And he was just generous enough to pull this out. He had an old ragged notebook that he transcribed and gave me. And that was 30 years after this took place. So, I mean, the trauma took place. So I'm very fortunate in many ways to have a window into what it was like at such an early age from somebody who really, looked closely into that window. So I believe basically what occurred through that analysis was that I was able to move from a place of abject terror and paralysis in many ways to incremental intrigue and even wonder about the new radical situation I was coming into. The encounter with otherness, really, with radical difference. I'll go into this more momentarily, but I do think it resonates a lot with what I would call, and Otto Rank calls the template for all subsequent anxiety and trauma, and that is birth. The radical shift that occurs at birth has parallels, it seems to me, to the radical shift and rip in one's world that trauma can bring up. And what my analyst provided in so many ways was a place where I could feel free to say and feel anything I wanted, and not be judged, to feel relatively safe, although I know it was very scary for me early on. I think the analysis lasted about a year. And basically begin to internalize a way of relating to myself that was much more supportive and holding of the turmoil that was going on inside me than what I was experiencing in my environment, I think very understandably and naturally, given the situation. And I think his rock solid presence was probably the most important aspect. I mean, he certainly asked me questions about what I was experiencing, as good analysts do. You know, I had a chance to begin to inquire, to become more curious about my situation, as opposed to just reacting. So he provided a kind of a template for greater reflection, deliberation, beginning to see what I would call the groundlessness and helplessness of my situation, more and more in terms of new possibilities that were emerging in my life, as opposed to just total horror and monsters. And actually, from that analysis, I began to become really, really interested in science fiction as a little kid. And there happened to be great television shows at the time that helped that journey, as well as books. But I was very wedded to the shows like Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits, One Step Beyond, which was about the paranormal. I was probably an unusual kid in that I was very into those shows, 6, 7, 8 years old. And I think I related a lot to the strange people, characters, places that were brought up in those shows. And yet I was fascinated by interesting moments of discovery. I can say that one episode that I vividly remember is Outer Limits. I think it was the first episode, where this electrified monster appears out of a radio tower in a small town. He's from outer space, and he gets electrified. And he's huge, 60 feet tall. And he begins a rampage to the center of town. And there you have the army is posed and with guns, and you have the townspeople with pitchforks and guns ready to try to destroy this thing, as we usually do in our sort of industrial consciousness. And so it starts like a typical B movie, monster coming to the center of town with being opposed by military. Well, the monster, when he gets to the center of town, looks down, says, "Put down your guns, go home, and contemplate the mysteries of the universe." And that was the end of the show. Very different from most B movies that we see. And that capsulizes so much of my own trip, my own journey from that earliest point of trauma, right to my trajectory out to being a psychologist, and moving from horror and terror to gradual curiosity and fascination, even with my own experience, with others' experience of living, the big questions of life. In many ways, beginning to see monsters more as sages, potentially, pointing the way to something radically different, radically other, that has possibilities and can be explored. So I'm more, because of the limited time we have and the kind of format, and given the small meeting we have, I do have PowerPoint, but I'm going to try to go through it pretty quickly, or maybe allow you to read it. glean what you can from it. Oops, let me try to get that clearer for you. But just this overall first point that, my thesis really in the book is that we have so much anxiety today, skyrocketing anxiety for so many reasons, from the pandemic to political polarization to racism to religious extremism and destructiveness. I mean, all these areas of destructiveness, war, violence, precisely because we're not facing the deeper and more primal anxiety that I just gave you an illustration of in a very, vivid way. That's prior to these, you could say, epiphenomenal anxieties. They're secondary to the fact that our society and many of the industrialized societies of the world have been bent on for many, many centuries, doing everything they can to eradicate anxiety. They do it through mechanization. Now we have technicization and devices that home in on basically the quick fix, instant result model for living, what I call the efficiency model for living. And these are designed in many positive ways to raise our standard of living, make things more convenient. Certainly helped us get out of the so-called dark ages. That was part of the impetus of the Enlightenment and rationalism with a capital R, back around the 1400s, but especially expressed in the 16 and 1700s. But there was a huge price that we paid, I think, and we've been paying. And Michel Foucault goes into this in Madness and Civilization. We threw the baby out with the bathwater. We've developed great ways of, I think we've advanced tremendously technically. Machine-mediated living. But as far as our inner life, our interior, we've not been very adept. I mean, we've had some great psychologists. I would certainly name, Freud among them, helping us to open up that interior life in a very bold way. I think he got the ball rolling in many ways. I think his metapsychology was quite restricted. It's much deeper and broader, existential, I would say, than how he portrayed it. But at least pointed us in that important direction. But I don't think we've emphasized that part of ourselves very well, generation after generation. And as a result, we carry a lot of transmitted trauma that's not dealt with. We, in many ways, live our lives, as Ernest Becker put it in Denial of Death, as a prophylaxis against terror. And so because we have not had substantive interventions in this way in our culture, and in similar cultures, we've got rampant destructiveness because we basically don't know how to handle these core primal anxieties. So I very much resonate with Otto Rank, and I don't know why I'm trying to, there we go. Otto Rank's notion of the trauma of birth, which he wrote in 1924, much to Freud's chagrin. This is one of the great tragedies of the psychoanalytic movement, in my view, and others like Robert Kramer, who's a leading Rank scholar, wrote a book that made a lot of this very plain and beautifully done, called The Birth of Relationship Therapy. Carl Rogers meets Otto Rank I wrote a review of it, suggesting that it could also be Rollo May meets Otto Rank. Rollo was also profoundly influenced by Rank. You could say that Rank was the founder of existential humanistic psychology. And that's a whole other story that I think we need to go into more. Some of us are fostering that or advocating that. But basically, Rank saw the birth experience as the template for virtually all subsequent trauma and anxiety, precisely because of what he calls the psychology of difference. That birth represents the profound shift from relative unity and non-being, or I should say relative non-being and unity, to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium. That sense of groundlessness and helplessness that all of us likely experience at the point of birth. And I did have the great privilege to witness my son's birth, and I experienced that, at least that was the sense I had of his birth, of just, extreme terror and kind of floundering helplessness at the beginning, shock. But then a kind of shift to wonder. It looked like it was looking around and curious. So this is why I have issues with the idea of trauma of birth. I call it the drama of birth, because I think it includes elements of both trauma and wonder. And so the big question here is, how is the child met in this psychology of difference? How is the radical encounter with difference, with otherness, that which is so other from where that child came from, how is that met? How is that supported? Or, sadly, reinforced? The fears and terrors of otherness, potentially reinforced by the caretakers, by the culture that greatly influenced the caretakers. Unfortunately, I think we have a lot of fear-driven people in our culture and among caretakers that foster, unfortunately, fear-driven individuals, children, who then become fear-driven adults to a great extent, and don't have that sense that people like D.W. Winnicott talked about, of being held and supported to work with the natural anxiety that comes up through the crucible of birth. And so basically there's no intervention, if you will, for many people. They go right into positions of fear, polarization, which I call the fixation on single points of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And that's a natural trajectory for fear-based consciousness. I think that's the beginning of all kinds of fears of ourselves, that which is foreign in ourselves, that we come into consciousness of, impulses, etc., as well as many forms of racism, bigotry, fanaticism, presumptions that have more to do with parental or cultural fantasies than actualities. So this is the critical beginning. I don't know about my own beginning. I sense that my own beginning was probably pretty good, but as I was saying before, trauma has a way of ripping open in a very intensive way, probably something very close to this sense of groundlessness and helplessness we experience when we are ejected. We are thrown, as Heidegger says, into life. And that's a lot to handle if you don't have some kind of intervention. I also would want to mention that some of these analysts who are existentially oriented, like Kohut, who talked about the transmuting internalization. So much of this is about providing a supportive, a vitalizing holding environment that then becomes internalized by the child, as I was saying that I did with my analyst in many ways as a very young child, develop new internalizations, new ways of relating to that horror that I was experiencing. And the transmuting part is, working through disruptions in the analysis or in the therapy in a very experiential way where you learn, not just intellectually, but with your whole body experience, a different way, a different model of holding the upheaval that you experience in the moment with your therapist, which I'm sure I had experience with my analyst as well. And I did want to mention also that we're several of us, including Bob Kramer and Siebrecht Van Horen of Belgium, are planning a conference on Otto-Rank in November 4th and 5th, to really celebrate and commemorate his founding of existential humanistic psychology. So this is some of the research that is pertinent to that whole notion of the trauma of birth, or the drama of birth. Karolinska Institute, a very prestigious institute in Sweden, found that stress hormones of newborns are higher than adult stress hormone release, and even higher than severe stress hormone release. Stress hormone release when adults experience severe stress. So we have, from a physiological standpoint, pretty strong evidence that something very, very intense and powerful occurs at the point of birth, as well as, again, all the theories that have burgeoned around, secure and insecure attachment, and the still face experiment, which is so powerful. I go into in my book as well, where they compare the usually mother's natural responsiveness and mirroring of the child from right in the earliest phases. They've done this as early as 2 hours after the birth. And then they have the controlled condition where the mother's told to go deadpan with the child. Just have a passive, indifferent face, no responsiveness, and how quickly the newborn deteriorates. I mean, it's almost within seconds that you see the decompensation of the child. They're floundering. They don't, those internalizations are just gone. It's just like being cut from the mothership and abandoned in space. Again, we really don't have time. I'd like to have a little time for discussion, but I think you can sense where this life-enhancing anxiety question, or the question of coming into the radical difference, either through birth or trauma, and being supported for that, learning new ways to be present, in particular, to one's cut off parts, can lead to fuller access to one's deepest dreads, most dysphoric feelings, which I think are integral to a fuller life, to have access to those, as well as one's capacity to transcend them, to venture out, to take risks, to be bold and curious. And this I call the sense of awe toward living. The humility and wonder, the capacity to be maximally present to one's smallness before the vastness of creation or existence, to our fragility, as well as capacity to venture out, take risks, and feel oneself participating in something much greater than oneself. This to me is the sense of awe, sense of adventure, to have the sense of adventure about living, as opposed to the humdrum routine or going through motions, which so many of us, tragically, do in our culture and society. And again, you can read more about this in the book. It's all there. These are some models of people who I believe have found an awe-based consciousness, capability of contacting those elements of wonder and discovery, even in very traumatic situations. Ernest Becker on his deathbed, writer of Denial of Death, when asked to describe his experience by Sam Keen of Psych Today, Becker was only 49 when he was dying of stomach cancer. And Keen asked him, you've learned about and written about death as much or more than anyone in our culture. What now that you're going through the experience, what is it like for you? And Becker said something to the effect that, well, I take solace from giving myself over when there's nothing left to the tremendous creative energies of the cosmos, to be used for purposes we don't know. And even if we feel misused in that process, that is the great consolation. I find that one of the most inspiring deathbed reflections I've ever heard. Talking about living a life to the hilt, really grappling with meaning and purpose of his life, but then at the end, giving up when there's nothing left to the tremendous creative energies of the cosmos. I call that enchanted agnosticism. It's taking mystery seriously. It's connecting with the awesomeness of being, of existence, and feeling an exhilaration simply in that, at some level, even though there's great sorrow and sadness about leaving the planet, leaving the life. And to be used for purposes we don't know. But those tremendous purposes cast a different light on that whole death and dying process, it seems to me. And then we have others, you can read more about them. Maya Angelou is very moving with her discussion of rape when she was 7 years old, but then finding solace and witnesses in her local library, people like Langston Hughes, inspiring her, people who had gone through great tragedy themselves. And again, therapists, healers, artists, etc., as models of people who had been through great trauma and yet learned how to hold it in much more emancipatory and creative ways. That's life-enhancing anxiety. And by the way, I should define life-enhancing anxiety. It enables us to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. And you might hear echoes of that again back in that crucible of the drama of birth, coming into difference, radical difference and otherness, and how We can live with it, learn to live with it, and make the best of what it opens up for us. So there's just some questions for us to consider, for you to consider. It may not relate to COVID, but could be a whole range of traumas, anxious moments that you've experienced in the last several years, or that's fresh for you. To reflect on, are there ways you can come into more awe-based consciousness? Is that even something you want to pursue? But looking at it from that frame, are you able to begin to, perhaps see the poignancy of life, the passing nature of time and life, which certainly trauma, depression, anxiety can bring up very acutely, making us more aware that our time is like a flash between two voids. How are we going to use it? Can we be open to wonder and surprise? Can we come at our struggle with some curiosity, begin to be intrigued by what it's opened up, not just totally deluged by it? Can we see its connection with something much greater than ourselves? What it opens up, our connection with the vastness of existence, perhaps a sense of participation in something much greater. Does it help us notice more about life, about our own lives in the world, as artists often do become privy to? So also the question of trust in the ultimately unknowable. I call it faith in the inscrutable. Not too many people talk about that kind of faith these days, but I think it's maybe worth contemplating, because it opens up many possibilities to live on this plane, but also maybe feel some kind of consolation about where we're all journeying, or just the fact how amazing it is that we're here and that there is something called life and consciousness. I don't care if it's all random. It's still awesome to me, no matter how you want to frame it. So I'll leave it there and open the floor to any reflections, questions. Maybe we'll go back to our fuller screenshots.
I have a question.
Sure, Olivia.
So I'm quite familiar with kind of what you articulated as that which enabled you to take the path towards life enhancing anxiety instead of the other option, and like that terror and dread and the quality of presence and the safe space and acceptance and non-judgment that analyst and psychotherapist was able to offer to you, and how that helped you reconnect to these like previously othered aspects of yourself. And that all makes sense to me. And for my own personal experience, I'm very kind of contemplative and abstract and analytical, and looking at systems and reverse engineering like that I thou encounter and quality of presence, and like what exactly constitutes that which enables that healing potentiality in those sacred encounters and therapeutic moments. However, more recently in my life, I've come into contact with more somatic, embodied, energetic type therapeutic modalities. And so there's one in particular that I wanted to bring to your attention and just ask your opinion regarding. And it's something called Wata Flow. like WATAFLOW. And I encountered it for the first time a few years ago in India. And basically, what happens is there's like a trained professional or practitioner, and you go ideally into the ocean with them. And what they do is they kind of instruct you beforehand when they'll tap you, and that signifies that they're going to bring you under the water and below the surface of the ocean. And then when they'll bring you up, and so you take a breath of air before they bring you under. And essentially, it's like skin to skin, that like physical contact, and they're kind of holding you like a baby. And you just have a little nose plug to not get water up your nose. And basically, they, in this like intuitive rhythm, like bring you under the ocean and above the ocean. And so, like scientifically, I'm like, I don't really know what's happening, but having experienced this firsthand energetically and having done it in a group of people, most people kind of in relationship to their attachment style either hold on beautifully and come out feeling this euphoria from having experienced that self-transcendent, like non-dual experience that sort of emulates that of being in the womb, and kind of circles back to the terror, wonder, birth template of that initial trauma. And then others who have more like anxious attachment styles, like, you know, their bodies end up shaking, and like so much of this is happening pre-consciously and non-intentionally, and yet so openly. Like, and I remember the practitioner was kind of teaching a group of people how to facilitate this, and like how to bring people through that experience. And he was saying, like, you always look at their face, and like a lot of people are just in the super blissed out, like euphoric, and a lot of people are like just super tight and tense. Um and then afterwards, when we came out of the water, we sat in a circle, and he just asked everyone what age they were feeling. And this practitioner, I don't think, had any background in psychology or academic kind of experience like that. And the group echoed ages from like 0 to like, you know, like 50 or something. But like a lot of them were like between, in those like most vulnerable ages. And so basically he would say, okay, like this person's feeling like they're 6 years old. Like, will you be the big brother to this person? And so my question is in regard to how you might convey the kind of therapeutic quality of energetically going back to that terror,
Yeah,
wonder, and birth experience through that.
it's a beautiful question. And I think it has resonances to baptism, to Stan and Christina Groff's holotropic breathing, which is also a kind of reenactment of the birth experience. R.D. Laing was also involved in some of that. It's a beautiful metaphor too, because I do often think of birth as a radical plunge into the vast unknown sea, into a vast unknown sea, where we meet all kinds of creatures and go to places that are very dark or strange. And the big question is, how do we learn to swim in those waters, you know, versus floundering and drowning in some way? So I relate to it on many levels. I'm also an ex-swimmer, so I relate to it that way. I think there are many paths to creating this kind of holding environment, to being met, that can be brought to bear in a very therapeutic way, and help create new internalizations for people suffering from trauma, regression, however you want to put it. And certainly, the more it can be grounded somatically, that could be very powerful. I find, in fact, my work emphasizes the experiential dimension of contact, especially for people who feel ready and able to go to those places. And that's where it becomes much less about, you know, attempting to understand it cognitively, etc. I think this is where interpretations pale, because they can't wrap around the experience that the person has.
Yeah, ineffable, pre-articulate.
Yeah, or through metaphor. People talk about drowning or being in a black
Mhm.
hole or being cut from the mothership. I mean,
Mhm.
free fall. I mean, these are the kinds of descriptions you get as people go deeper into these places. And so I try to make room for people to connect with their bodies in those places. I even have something I call embodied meditation, where I invite people to begin with contacting where you're feeling this in your body, what you're sensing in your body. Maybe even place your hand on that area. And it's fascinating to see how sometimes the floodgates open up in terms of associations around contact, literal contact with places in our body. I do feel that for many people, until they're able to have a whole body experience of greater access to their thoughts, feelings, sensations, imaginings, that fuller healing uh, does not generally take place unless they can have a whole body access, whole body experience of living, living in and through those moments. And that's why, I mean, exposure on the behavioral level can certainly be helpful on the cognitive level, but I think this is much more than just exposure. It's not just overt and measurable kind of experience. It's also, it has a great deal to do with the inner life. Can one again hold hold and illuminate that which is palpably significant within oneself and between oneself and the world? That's kind of my definition of presence. So presence is just critical here. And certainly that kind of experience, you call it wata flow, sounds like it can be transformative. I do think that the people who are facilitating such experiences need to be adept at, following up if needed, and really tuning into what may be, expressing itself, or even breaking out of the person's consciousness at those times. Very interesting.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
that just I'm continuously fascinated by how the Western psychotherapeutic and medical model doesn't so much educate on or account for these more pre-articulate psychosomatic experiential moments of healing, and how personally being in my second year of my master's in existential humanistic psychology, still these experiences, though I've seen them and I've experienced them myself, feel so mystified. And yeah, so just really interesting. Thank you so much for your response. I really
Yeah,
appreciate that.
thank you. And I'll just say quickly that I had a much more experiential contact with a later therapist when I was in graduate school and things were really breaking apart. That was just pivotal for the rest of my life. We're talking, I don't know, 40 some years. So thank you. Anyone else like to engage? Yes. Is it Chamath?
No, no, you were right the first time. It's Cham.
Chamath.
Yes, thank you.
Oh,
I did a quick search while you were talking, and apparently you're quite eminent and well known. My apologies for not knowing that beforehand.
no,
It's
no
an
need
honor to be. It's an honor to be in your presence, even virtually. My question, I have a few, and I'll start with those and not comment too much because there may be others who want to talk as well. Do you or have you used or are you familiar with the use of hypnotherapy as a way of regressing to the birth experience? Do you think that is useful in your line of thinking? And second, when you talk of life-enhancing anxiety, I get the sense that it's not based on symptoms. Like, do you define that based on symptoms, or do you have a different way of describing or defining it? Does my question make sense or no? Do I need to clarify further?
I think it does. Let me reflect a moment, because your first, what was your first question again? Because I'm trying to hold.
Hypnotherapy as a means of regressing to the birth experience. Are you
Hypnotherapy.
familiar with that? Do you find it useful? And the second one is about definition.
Yeah, I've heard of hypnotherapy, or regression therapy, if you want to call it that. It seems to be in resonance with what I'm describing here, and I would guess that it would promote or could promote life-enhancing anxiety by helping a person to work back through their thrownness into existence, and maybe provide some corrective experiences for them through the induction. So I don't know a lot about that whole realm, but yes, I have heard about it, and it would be interesting to look into that further in terms of this dimension of life-enhancing anxiety. As far as your second question, that was about whether I just described life-enhancing anxiety in terms of symptoms, or maybe you could.
Yes. Yeah. How do you define or describe it? Is in relation to, say, generalized anxiety, and those are usually described in terms of symptoms in DSM and so on and so forth. How do you differentiate and describe life-enhancing anxiety?
Well, first of all, I see it as a much more holistic dimension, and it's adding dimensions to the conventional categories of anxiety. I think that's something we've overlooked. We've really homed in on, the dreadful and paralyzing and grim sides of anxiety, but not the elements of wonder and discovery. And this is something that Rollo May also brought up wonderfully very early on in The Meaning of Anxiety, his dissertation, which he turned into a book in 1950. And much of my work is an homage to Rollo, who is my mentor. But he wrote it for the 1950s. He saw us as becoming much more too mechanical in those times, and look where we are now in some ways in terms of mechanization. So I felt it was important to highlight the multidimensionality of anxiety, especially for our era, that's so focused on speed, instant results, and appearance and packaging of things. And I think many of our conventional models are focused on that, unfortunately, and don't get to the deeper aspects of anxiety. So what I would say is that I'm not just talking about the overt and measurable aspects of anxiety. I'm talking about that invigorating level of anxiety that is very hard to define in strictly measurable terms, but can be felt, that brings a sense of enlivening and animation to a person's experience of whatever it is, a relationship, a project, a form of spirituality. That I think relates to a more optimal child rearing, engagement with work, spiritual and religious settings, and even deliberative settings, the whole ethical sphere. Coming at those settings from a place of more of genuine curiosity and wonder, versus just knee-jerk reaction or reactivity. is much of what I'm trying to, emphasize here. Creativity too. I mean, what Rollo said, I begin my book with Rollo's quote that anxiety and freedom are flip sides of a coin. In many ways, I think that's true. I think anxiety certainly can be overwhelming and sometimes needs certain interventions that are more external oriented, let's say, to help somebody get through the night or what have you. But at its fuller and deeper level, it's often a signal of being on the brink of discovery, being on that edge of wonder and possibility that comes along with a fuller life. And that's one of my problems with how life is conventionally defined. It's often one-dimensional, as functional adjustment to this job or this relationship, et cetera. Yeah, I'm sorry. It looked like Al, you had a.
Yeah, I live with a lot of anxiety, and one of the things I'm aware of is that it's because I care. If I didn't care about anything, I wouldn't be anxious. And I looked up I did the etymology on anxiety. And so there's a Latin word, anxus, A-N-X-U-S. And when I looked at the meaning of that, the word solicitous came up. And then I looked at the meaning of the word solicitous, and solicitous is a combination of eagerness and apprehension. What I thought was pretty amazing, as a definition of anxiety, a combination of eagerness and apprehension.
Interesting. Eagerness and apprehension.
Yeah. And so etymology, looking at the etymology of the word, that's what came up.
Very interesting. And that feels close to the sense of awe as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
How do you spell it again? A-N?
A-N-X-U-S was the Latin word.
Okay.
But I went to etymology and looked up anxious, and that's what I came up with, was the Latin word anxious, A-N-X-U-S, and then solicitous as a meaning of, and then solicitous being a combination of eagerness and apprehension. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. Yeah.
It's a lot of roots here. I don't know what's going on with our video, but
That's me. My machine doesn't have enough capacity to do it.
Okay. Your machine is not experiencing life-enhancing anxiety.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Chamath, for the excellent questions too. Olivia as well.
I have a lot more thoughts and questions, but I think we're at the end of the time. I was wondering, there's a lot of conversation going on about the limitations of the DSM symptom, the medical model,
Yes.
and stuff. So your kind of work, I think, is really important to stimulate more thinking. I'm excited about that. And also I was wondering whether how it's related, your work is related to the current interest in trauma-informed. It's big in education and in lots of other fields where I also work a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think that folks who are studying trauma, like van der Kolk, are beginning to enter into these fuller dimensions of the experience, which is a good thing. I'm not sure that it's being made, that the fuller dimensions are being made explicit enough, which is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, and really wanted to put anxiety front and center to our cultural ways of seeing things, I guess, because it's often, brushed in a very negative way, and there's so much more to the dimension of anxiety, and it's so necessary, I think, for the kind of reform we need culturally and individually to survive, not only thrive as a species. So I hope that research is moving more in that direction. I also share with you a lot of concern about the DSM. I have for many years. I've long been an adherent of R.D. Laing's perspective on mental health, which he called the hatred of health. I think it was a little extreme, but his book, Politics of Experience, I highly recommend. It's a whole reframe on, our over focus on individual pathology, so to speak, and way under focus on collective pathology, and how individual pathology is impacted by the collective. I mean, war is a sickness. If you're going to say mental disorder is a sickness, war and violence is a sickness that operates in a very similar way to narcissism, sociopathy, and paranoia. I mean, let's face it, folks, we've got cultural pathology all over the place. And we're not devoting near enough time to addressing that. And that was another reason for my book and delving into trying to expose the lack of life-enhancing anxiety in our culture and ways of addressing that through, for example, bridge-building dialogues that I've been involved with, through Braver Angels and experiential democracy dialogue, advocating for, relating across the great chasm of difference. Again, it all comes back to the same kind of thing. Can we develop better holding environments for each other? Can we have more humanizing conversations where we're seeing the whole human being before us, not just the stereotype or the label, which is fear-based and is the polarized mind, drives us to a single point of view, to the exclusion of competing points of view. It kind of all goes back to the same problem, in my view. And how do we address that later on, since we're not catching people as newborns, although I hope we're learning more ways of optimizing that as well. But how do we bring, quote, interventions of that nature? I'm not quite comfortable with that word, but you know what I mean, to adults and our adult divisions and estrangements.
All right, sorry to cut people off, but we're over time here.
Okay.
Thank you, Kirk. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Mick.
It was.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Kirk.
Very welcome. Great to see you and connect with you and everyone.
All right.
To be continued.
To be continued.